respects to their elders as well. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So on that note, we're going to continue our storytelling on this land tonight with the launch of this beautiful book, the Brisbane launch of this beautiful book. I'd like to make that happen, if you have your phones on you in real life, if you could switch them to silent, that'd be excellent. Of course, those of you who are at home do not need to switch your phones to silent because you're all on silent. But if you do want to engage in social media, please feel free to do so. I will be tweeting some pictures out tonight from @AvidReader4101, so please feel free to join me. We'll save our questions for the very end of the event. So of course, people in real life, we will have time for questions at the end. And people on Zoom, we will be taking questions at the end. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests tonight. Of course, we have Erina Reddan, who is an award-winning journalist. She's worked as foreign correspondent with the ABC and won a prestigious Walkley Award for her broadcast work. She has worked across radio and television and now trains people in communication skills, as well as puts together very beautiful, beautiful books. And speaking with Erina tonight is Tegan Taylor, who is the health and science journalist in the ABC Science Unit. You may have heard her dulcet tones on Australia's most downloaded podcast, the Coronacast, which I listen to regularly every single day. So this is like my lunch break at home, except that we won't really be talking about whether Brisbane is in lockdown or not. But everybody, I'll pass over to Tegan. Welcome, Tegan Taylor.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and thank you, Erina, for sharing. So anyone who's read The Serpent Skin knows that it's a very personal book, and that at the introduction it sort of alludes to the fact that it's drawn from experiences that you have had. And so we're going to delve in with some personal questions tonight. Let's start by asking, the introduction to the book has a picture of a house and some notes about your early life. Can you tell us about that and just how autobiographical the book is?
I can, but first of all, I just want to say how great it is to have all of you here and all of you here in Zoomland, because we have had such a year of difficulty. So to gather together, to give each other this kind of energy is really beautiful, and I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate Avid Bookshop, iconic Avid Reader Bookshop, because you do so much for Australian stories. So thank you. And then I totally agree with what Chrissy said, which is the whole idea. Oh, that's much better, isn't it? The whole idea. You'd think I'd know this. I was a radio journalist. The whole idea of we in Melbourne were locked down for a very long time. You guys have done such a great job because you're out so fast. We're not out fast, but we listen to you like we needed that sustenance every day. So I want to publicly thank you for the kind of work that you and Norman have done to really keep Australia going. And it's partly because of that we've done so well. So thank you.
Thank you, but we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about you.
It's my turn. Okay, so the story is, the way this story began is that my brother is I'm from the world that's represented in this book, in The Serpent Skin. And the reason why I started to write this book is that my brother was approached as a stock agent. He was selling the cows, and a guy was waiting for him for quite a long time. And he's, what's that guy doing there? He's not buying anything. And then finally, the guy at the end, he walks up and he said, I was back at your place in the day. And I happened to have a Box Brownie new camera, and I took a photo of your place. So, oh, that's even better again. So, would you like a photo of your house? Now, we grew up in pretty big poverty. We didn't have cameras and photos. So this was the first photo that we'd seen of the house. So my brother was very excited. So he turned the slide into a photo, blew it up, framed it, put it on the wall, and invited us all around.
How many is all?
There's 6 children. So we're all there. And there was a lot of chatter about oh my gosh, this is the house, which we loved, by the way. You know, when you live in a house full of cracks that it is, it's your imaginative place of your childhood. So it holds a lot of possibilities and richness. But we all kind of stopped talking, and it was my brother who said it. How could the old man let us live in that? But the creative journey is not actually, for me, I didn't want to write an autobiographical novel. So what I wanted to do is to take that inspiration and write about my world. But I don't find my life particularly interesting. Well, it's interesting to me, but as a writer, I really want to write a story that propels people. So I really want twists and turns, so that the story builds and the energy builds, so that you have a great crescendo. So that's why I'm really interested in fiction. So I wanted to tell the story of not us, but people like us. So I say it's my world, but they're not the characters. I made the characters up and I made the events up. So when my sister says, well, people are asking me if that happened to our mother, I go, yeah, well, it didn't, and we know that. But it's, that's a difficult thing, because it is so recognizable, that world of kind of epic struggle to survive on the land, and the kind of the bitterness that kind of poverty draws in was certainly something I experienced. And the setup of stories, like, for instance, there's a scene where there's a rosary. So that did happen to us, the setup of the scene. But then what happens in that scene, the event, that wasn't us. So that happened to those 4 kids in the story.
The poverty that you describe, like a different author or people have in the past, like portrayed that same kind of living off the land in country Australia. It's romanticized, that you sort of these gritty people who are just making the best of, but it's a good story. Whereas you really kind of look at it through a different lens. It's really kind of exposing how tough that life is.
I think it's tough because when you don't have money, when you're worried about where the money's coming from, and you don't have a great livelihood. Living on the farm is not a great livelihood, and it comes in irregularly. There's a lot of tension in the world. I do think that poverty is romanticized, but neither did I live in Angela Ashes, if anyone recognises that kind of life. Like that was kind of the generation before us. So I feel pretty lucky that we did have food, because we lived on a farm. So that was always taken care of. We had meat, I hate to say it, but my dad used to, when it was time for the annual slaughter of the cows, they'd get our monkey bar and hang the carcasses on it. And we get it back with all the dry blood, and didn't even notice. That's what farm kids did until the next year.
Yeah, it's life on the land. And then another theme that really kind of this very strong undercurrent in the book is Catholicism, like the Catholic belief system. Can you talk about your experience of that and how it compares with the book?
Yeah, because they're quite different. When you read Serpent, you get an experience of the constraints that the Catholic Church can create. And I actually see it a bit like, I think that male power, where it's unquestioned, is always going to be difficult. It's always going to cause problems. We see that in the army. We see that in hospitals, in surgeons. We see that in many places, but it's nowhere more stark than in the Catholic Church, because you've got God, then you've got the Pope, then you've got the priests, the bishops, the priests, and then you've got the Father. And the Father has authority and is responsible, as my real father was, for making sure that his children and his wife didn't end up in hell, which was a very visceral experience for him. But I was lucky to actually have been born post-Vatican II. So it was more, God of love rather than the hell and brimstone. So I kind of lived, my oldest, there's 2 time zones in the book. There's the first one, which is in the late 1960s, where little JJ, who's a 10-year-old kid, her mother disappears one day, and it doesn't make sense. Like, her mother's a devoted mother, and there's no trace of her, and her father tells a whole stack of lies about it, and she's kind of bringing the trouble. So this is a book about a girl that actually tries to find a voice, a bit like what it's the current conversation we're having. What visibility can women have in the world? What is their story? What value that has? And it tends to be eclipsed with male power, as we are experiencing at the moment. But it particularly back then with the constraints and the tightness of the Catholic Church really brought that into play. So it really is slightly before my time, as in it was more the representative of my sister's Catholicism. Having said that, I lived in a family that was incredibly Catholic. And when I say Catholic, I mean it's tied up in a whole lot of knots of what you were supposed to be doing in order to gain your path into heaven. So in terms of storytelling, that's a very rich world to be able to explore that. But the reason why I wanted to do that rather than tell a contemporary story was because when you look back at the past, it's so obvious that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that women are in that position where men can have that much control over them. But I also want to, and it was very normalized, but I also want to look at what do we normalize today? What are the conditions that women and men choose to live in, the way we've organized ourselves, that doesn't make sense?
Do you have an example of that?
Well, I have many, as it turns out. I think the whole way that when we give birth to our children, we stay home and look after the children. And the men go to work and we become experts and very competent. And I'm not talking about every single relationship. I'm talking about the general way we do this. And so we become very empathetically involved with the child, very physically capable. So we end up doing a lot of the mental load, a lot of the emotional load, and a lot of the physical load because we can do it faster. So we end up doing things like we always know who their friends are. We always know what their teachers' names, what's going on in their learning systems. We always know when they grow out of clothes, who's going to work out where they go to. Oh, well, I can send that to Sally and I can send that over to. That mental load is going on all the time around the children, plus quite a lot of other stuff. And I compare that with modern day experiences of what's going on in Nordic countries where women get maternity leave and then men get paternity leave. So they actually end up getting quite skilled, both of them, in looking after children. And what we know about those societies is there's a big flow on to less domestic violence, more respect between sexes. And I think that's really important.
So feminism is like a not subtle undercurrent in this story. Can you talk about these female characters? Because they're written in a time and in a setting where there were a lot of constraints on them, and yet they find ways to work what they're trying to do.
I think they do two things. I think they absolutely covert guerrilla underground workers to support each other. I grew up in a world where my mother had 8 pregnancies and 6 live children, and by the end there was no contraception. Well, there was, but it didn't work, clearly, the rhythm method. By the end, she was very ill, and so she had her last child. She couldn't look after that child. So a neighbour from across the street, we didn't have streets, across the creek, who had 2 toddlers of her own, she took that newborn baby. And if anyone has had a baby in this room, you know newborns are not easy. They constantly need your attention. Another woman took the 11-month-old child, myself, for 6 months. And she already had 6 children. So that kind of support really infuses the serpent skin, the way women band together and know things about each other and are always there to support each other. They kind of create a tissue that keeps the whole community going. That was my experience, and it's the experience that feeds into the serpent skin. However, they also policed each other because there were so many rules. So there was a kind of a sense of judgment all the time that women have to, the kids have to be very nicely plaited, the hair, and, they have to look good because there's what will so-and-so think. So there's a lot of that going on as well. It's quite complex because women were both colluding and creating this guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, those tight-knit communities, it kind of cuts both ways.
Yeah, it cuts both ways, yeah.
And then what about, can you talk about the father figure in this story? Because he's such a complex character, deeply flawed, and I don't know, I found him actually a really compelling character.
Well, I love Jack myself. JJ has this, the whole spine of the Serpent Skin is that relationship between JJ and Jack, where JJ is constantly trying to kind of catch Jack out in his lies and all the things that he's trying to obfuscate. And yet, so they distrust each other. Jack is worried that JJ is going to ask that one question too many. And JJ is always trying to ask that one question too many, to catch him out, to watch him. So what happens in the first part of the book, she's 10 years old and she decides in the end to give up trying to find out what happened to her mother, because there's a question that she might be given away. Those are the days where you kept the boy, but all the girls got farmed out. So she decides her loyalty has to be with her lying father rather than her disappeared mother. She gives up asking questions. But when she's 24, in the 80s, she stumbles across a clue that shows that all was not well in her world, in her home that she grew up in. So then she goes back, and this time she won't let anything. This is where she finds her voice that has been suppressed. And she finds it for all the siblings, because all the siblings have been damaged in some way, although they all ignore it except her. And she kind of does, the energy builds to this crescendo at the end where she does find out what it is. And that's where she really confronts Jack. And he is undone by the truth in the end. What I'm very interested in is not creating a monster. I'm very interested in actually, because yes, patriarchy does create monsters of all of us and heroes of all of us. But we know that story. We know the story of pedophilia. I wanted to create something where a flawed man is empowered by an institution that really just allows men to have too much control, basically. So, and yet through all of that, there's this kind of love. They keep reaching out to each other in compassion and trying to make the connection, because they really do love each other through it all. And that's the complexity. There's love and danger and betrayal and distrust. And that's, it all kind of entwines together like a slippery snake.
I think that's what I like about it, is that even if you haven't had that experience, if you haven't, grown up in those circumstances or haven't had that religious upbringing, that those sorts of not always functional relationships within a family are really familiar.
Well, for me, particularly having grown up in what I would call one of those epic families where despite the damage, you cleave together because that's the way you survive. You look after each other. You are a tribe. And to, having said that, the family that in the book is similar in that sense to the family I grew up in. We're a very tight family. Any event that's on, my sister will be there baking cakes and bringing the food, which I'm not very good at because I was a feminist and I decided not to learn to cook. Bad decision, as it turned out. But I'm very interested in the way that families can operate as both functional and dysfunctional at the same time. But also the family relationships, the siblings, that's the one, they're the ones that bring the lightness in the book, because there's quite a lot of, they just put shit on each other and tease each other. And I love that kind of relationship. And it actually creates the alternative, the richness of what a family is. A family is never, well, from my experience, I'm glad to say, is never dark, just dark. And you do live ordinary lives, but all this stuff seethes under the bottom. But you also need the lightness to go with it.
Can we talk about your journey to becoming a novelist? Because obviously you come from this situation where you're in poverty, the education system isn't really supporting you the way it does for people who maybe live closer to major cities. What did it take for you to get out of that situation into this situation now where we're sitting here and I'm interviewing you about your wonderful book after a very illustrious career in journalism?
It took books. It actually takes stories. I read all the time, so I lived in alternative worlds. I read stories. We had our library we didn't have a library, but the library in our school was one shelf at the back of and I read all those books. And I remember one story about this little boy in Siena doing a paleo race in the, like it's called, what's it called? It's a famous race anyway.
Marathon?
No, it's with horse racing. Yeah, I just can't remember it. Anyway, what's it called? No, it's in the middle of the square, and they have all these medieval tribes from all the different barrios, all the different suburbs, and they come together to horse race in the middle of the town.
Someone's got it.
No.
No one.
Sorry. If you know, if you Zoomers know, please put it in the comments and we'll take it in the question section.
Anyway, when I grew up, I went to this square and I stood in that square, and that connection between the imagination of that little boy doing this, living that life, to me in where I was living, and then to make it into reality. That was incredible. So I read to survive, basically. That's why I really am so grateful to readers and to writers, because we keep being able to tell our stories. And then as I grew up, I these days you can go to school, and there's quite a lot of people that come to school and they will tell writers will tell you, this is how I became a writer. But there was none of that for us. So I just thought, only very special people do that. In fact, when I watched TV and people would send in things to Cartoon Corner, I didn't know what that was about. Like, that was like aliens who lived out over there. So I had no sense of the external world at all, actually.
So what was the process like for you? How did you move from the Catholic school that you went to Melbourne Uni?
Yeah, I decided to go to uni. I have no idea why. Very few from my school went. There was only a handful of us, and no one from my family. I don't know. I think it must have been from some book somewhere. And that changed my life. And so I didn't think I could write, but I did think I could become a journalist. And then
We don't write very much. It's fine.
Yeah, that's true. But when I went to uni, there was all these very famous people there. You know, I was at Melbourne Uni, and there was like Jamie Button, who was the son of a federal minister, Deborah Cass, who was the daughter of a federal minister, and they were running the newspaper. I said, that's not for me either then. Because I think many, many people feel like they're outsiders. So I'm not suggesting that my experience was unique, but it is a particular kind of outsiderness. And so I didn't know how to be an insider. However, when I left uni, I was doing absolutely nothing. So I had an arts degree. For some reason, I didn't get one of those, I didn't even apply for one of those those internships and graduate programs. So I was kind of just drifting around, and I drifted into radio, and then I drifted into community radio. Then I actually got sacked, but I had the makings of a great document. I got sacked because I was an upstart wanting more money in community radio, as only the young can do. Anyway, then I had all this documentary, a great documentary. So I took it to the ABC, and just it happened to it was about Tibet, and Tibet really there was a major uprising, and I had the documentary ready to go the next day. So it looked pretty good that I was had some magic of foresight, and that kind of propelled me into the world of journalism. And then eventually I had a child, and I just knew that I would never have the time to write again. So I better start. And that's where it started.
Were your family proud of you, of your academic success?
Oh, you asked some very difficult questions. I think they probably are. My sisters and brothers would certainly rate my successes with their own. I mean, everyone is successful in their own ways, and we are that kind of a family. However, it was a dark place to go. To go to university was to really turn your back on the tribe. And my father found that very difficult. And he was a very mild-mannered man that everyone loved, but he was furious, and he raged at me for going to university, because it meant, I think now, that I was leaving something that he understood, and he could no longer protect me because I was out in the world. Not that the world we grew up in was particularly a protected, safe place, but it just meant I was beyond his reach. And I think my mother finally, when I got a degree, she was much happier, but she also felt an arts degree was not the right road to happiness and success.
But despite that, and despite your outsider status and all of these things that you're saying, if you look at the cover of this book, you're getting some endorsements of some pretty impressive names. How did you get in with that network of writers?
It's called courage. And this is and we all need courage to live. But as a writer, this is the particular way. Leah, who's sitting in the audience with me tonight from Pantera Press, who we worked on the Serpent Skin together. They basically said to me, you need endorsements now. And I went, oh my giddy aunt, where do I get them from? I happen to have, and so I asked people, but in fact, it is a big ask to ask someone to read your book. And also they put their reputation on the line. I mean, like they have to really, really love it because they're going to go on the front cover.
It would be awkward as well if you asked someone and they didn't like it. You're like, I don't want to write you a recommendation anymore.
Well, they all said that because I didn't know them personally. Well, one is a friend of mine. So I knew she'd be okay. She's going to do it. But I've got 5 or 6 endorsements, and all of them said, well, we will, in the end, we'll give it a go. So for instance, Christos Tsiolkas, I went to uni with him. I haven't seen him since uni. That's 30 years ago. He's a major luminary, but he's also a beautiful man. So when I reached out to him, within a heartbeat, he said, yeah, I'll give it a go. And then he did fall in love with it. So that was great. So I had that kind of a literary person. But the first person I asked was a man who I'd only met briefly because I happened to have been in a writer's workshop with his wife, who's a beautiful writer and linguist as well. So that was Graham Simpson, and he's a big star. Like he's one of our best-selling authors. No, I just want to ask my friend because I didn't want to put her in that position. And we're colleagues, not besties. So I wrote to Graham, and he said, "Yeah, I'm happy to read it." And within a few weeks, he came back and said, "I'm not only happy to read it, I'm happy to support it because this is beautiful Australian storytelling." So those two gave me a lot of courage then to actually start asking some other people. But it is actually having to stand up and speak it's like when you've got a child, for those of you who've got children, you mightn't stand up for yourself, but you will for your baby, you will for your child, you will actually tell that teacher to back off in a way that you probably mightn't do yourself. So yeah.
So this is your first novel, and you've obviously worked as a journalist and in communications. Can you talk about your approach to writing and what your novel writing process is like?
Yeah, I think I have written and been published before, but it's been a long time since then. It's been about 10 years. And I really decided in that time I wanted to learn to be I did want to be a good writer. So I just really studied a lot. Every book I got, I would annotate. I would go to, I've got several writing groups. I would go and to write, I still do professional development all the time because I really believed that there's a depth that you need to hit and then you find your voice, which I did in the end, but it took a while.
It is interesting. You sort of mentioned this idea of writers being mysterious creatures, and I think that there's sometimes this narrative that it's this gift and that someone's just gifted, but a musician practices their instrument and a dancer practices their craft. But why shouldn't writers also practice and improve?
I think you start off like anything, like if you have a knack for languages or a knack for science, you start off with the desire, but you've got to bring the craft. So I see writing as, well, there's 3 things I go for in writing. One is I'm really interested, as I've said before, in a story that really propels people forward and it builds in energy and crescendos and there's a big payoff at the end. So I'm interested in plot and storytelling. I'm also interested in the way the words fit together. So I really want each word to, kind of hold a rhythm that sits with the other words. I want them to not just be the word on the page, but they've also got to be the voice of the character and propel the story forward and hold the theme. So that takes a while. So actually, I usually write many drafts to get that so that each word is doing what it's supposed to do. And then the final thing that is, I think it has to be nourished by some big ideas. I really think that if it's going to stay with people, it has to actually bring people into a sense of humanity which they can recognise and actually cogitate over, like it sits with them. That's what I'm interested in.
So you have written this book and there's a real theme of strong, empowered female characters, especially these young women. And you've also written a PhD on girl warriors in young adult fiction, which I want to read. Did they inform each other? What was the timeline of the two?
All my work is about women living in a world that is not built for them. And I'm interested in the ways they can covertly and overtly challenge that to find a way to live richly. So I've written several novels. This is my second published, but I did a PhD in Girl Warriors, and it was called Blood and Ball Gowns, because the whole idea behind it was that we've got since the 2000s with the Hunger Games and all those, we had a lot of great new girl warriors who are active and out there. And yet at the same time, nearly all the covers of those young adult books were filled with girls in ball gowns. So it's like, yeah, we will let you have agency and get out there and fight for what you want, but not until you prove that you're harmless and can twirl in a sparkly dress. So I really was interested in that. So I did an action thriller I've written a young adult action thriller novel about a girl warrior, basically, who doesn't have to twirl in a sparkly ball gown because she finds her voice in a different way. I think that's one of the, not that I'm against ball gowns, it's all about context, but it has been seen as one of the few ways that girls can be visible. And I think girls and women need to be visible in many, many, many other ways.
So you talk about women fitting in a world that is not made for them, but then equally you look at especially the early chapters of this book and it's bleak and we've come so far. Do you ever see an end point with the fight for gender equality?
I think this is a question that every conscious woman asks themselves, and they would hope the answer is yes. There's been many yeses, and that's what we have to hold to. We have to hold that we do make difference. And we're at a moment in Australia right now where we are on the precipice of a big yes. If we could change things so that men and women, so men's lives are valued the same as equally as women's lives, because that's the nature of patriarchy. Women just have less value. Women's voices are less heard. So yes, we're all looking for that, and we all must do it in small and big ways. So I was talking to someone today, and they were saying that we were working in a space that had all these things of the great women. And there's Joan, she just moved in, she just started a new job. And Joan Kerner is there. She said, first you get angry, then you get organised. I thought, yeah, it's not going to mean anything unless we do start to organise. So I am a very optimistic person. But the reason why I wanted to put it back there is because, yeah, we've come a long way. And we've got a long way to go, but we are not alone. Patriarchy doesn't work for anybody. It's very rare to find the one man that it actually works for, because even those, that we hear about so many of the kind of men that benefit, white, middle-class, straight guys, they're missing out on the richness of life because they're not with their kids, because they're not, that emotional world is not available to them. It doesn't work, it works for so very few people. We all need to change it. And I think we're beginning the next phase of that.
Yeah, and the book really does tease that out as well, the way the patriarchy doesn't work for the male characters either. There is one more theme that I wanted to talk to you about, and that's mental health, mental illness. That's something that's alluded to a lot in the book. It's sort of almost used as a weapon sometimes against women. Can you talk to that a bit?
Yeah, well, I think if you wanted to be a rebel back in the 60s, you wore purple dresses and were seen as mad. I think, thank God, we have so many more options for the way women want to live in the world. We're not there yet, but we have many more options. So women, there is a character in the book who I love, Peg, who's JJ's aunt, who's a hoarder. She's actually gone into the world of she wanted to live a different life. She was very kind of a live sexual kind of a woman, and she would have to be closed down. So her expression was then to go, okay, I'm really going to rebel. So it's never quite clear, because she's positioned as she's mad in the book, because you didn't have mental health, you had madness. And there was kind of, I lived with a grandmother who had undiagnosed bipolar, and she wore a lot of purple. She would get me clothes from the tip, and I would very happily wear them. It was often we would have clothes that she had, scurried about, but she got some great treasures. I still wear one today, and it is purple and orange. I think that is the nature of people who fall through the cracks, and they have to find a way to live. But on the other hand, they were also accepted. Like the people around her loved her, like they really admired and loved Peg, and they made room for her. It's that whole same thing of when a society is that constrained, it's the closing down, the covert and the overt. You know, the closing down where you're not allowed to be who you really are, so you have to hide behind layers. But at the same time, given that, we will look after you in that world. It's so complex, I find.
Well, we're nearly at the time to take questions. So just a reminder to our friends on Zoom that you can write your questions and we will be taking them as part of our live audience question and answer as well. So finally, Erina, what do you hope people take from your work apart from just a really cracking read?
That's the first thing. I really, really, really want people just to love reading it and to be immersed in it. And I've had a lot of reviews and people have said that to me. So that's the job done. A lot of people, you know, have experienced that. I also really want people to connect with the characters. I want people to be in love with the characters because, again, and people are saying that that's what's happening to them. They feel they want JJ to win, and they can see that Jack is flawed, but he's not a monster. Like how tragic that he was in that world. So that's important to me. But then the big idea is, and it's actually, you know, the way this book is, it's about the serpent skin, and it's actually, when you touch the book, it's got a beautiful kind of
gloss. It's got a gorgeous texture. The
whole idea is that it is a book about transformation and the possibility to transform. It is a book of light and dark, but through that, I really believe that in the darkness creates the light. And the snakes shed their skin every year. We humans actually renew every single cell in our body every 7 years. So the question is, can we, you know, leave our pain? Can we shed our pain along with the cells? And the answer is yes. It's about redemption. And it's also, I'm very interested in looking at those institutions with male power so that we can actually see them for what they are. They actually stultify the voices of many people, not just women. And the Serpent Skin is really a retake of a young woman trying to acquire knowledge. And we know that when that happened, the founding myth of Western culture is Adam and Eve, where Eve was tempted by the serpent and she decides she reaches for the apple of knowledge, and she is punished, and we're all thrown out of Eden for that. And from ever afterwards, the men have positioned women as evil and both weak and evil. I mean, Adam was tempted as well and did it, but he doesn't get the bad rap, does he? So I really wanted to retell that story, that a woman can reach for knowledge and she's not punished. She finds the truth. And that does set her free and the people she loves free.
Beautiful. Do we have questions? We'll take a couple of questions from our live audience and then we'll get some from our Zoom piece. Who wants to kick us off?
I love JJ's young voice, and I'm studying sociology, and I'm really interested in how you change lots of adverbs and adjectives into nouns, and that's really the character of the voice. And I wonder whether does this happen?
So the just for the benefit of our audience on Zoom, we're talking about the, I want to say, nounification of a lot of adjectives and adverbs in JJ's young voice.
For instance, an example, she might say something like, you know, I feel the deep of it. I don't know if that's very good. It's the only one that comes to my mind. I didn't do that consciously. When you enter in, as all of us who created know, that process, the voice comes to you. And the thing that I needed to reach for JJ is that she doesn't feel right in the world. She feels very raw, as if she's got a layer of skin fewer than the rest of us.
So she feels unprotected, and that's why having her mother is so important, because her mother creates the skin. Literally, we have a scene where she creates the skin. She holds JJ together. I don't mean literally. I mean, like emotionally. But there is a scene that says that. So it's just the voice that came to me, and I don't. Like the other characters don't speak like that, but she speaks like that, and I think it's because she needed to. She found that language didn't serve her. It wasn't precise enough. Even though we know that English has many words and it's quite precise, but it just couldn't explain her emotions. And I really like that, because I think most of us can't really explain. We don't have the words for what's really going on inside us. And that's why I think she's such a successful character, because she actually does something that we try to do, and she does do it.
More questions from the people in person? We do have some questions from Zoom. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the questions from Zoom is about the title and the cover, and if you can talk us a little bit through the process of choosing a title and cover.
Well, I'll start off with the title. I think there's several layers that the title speaks to. The Serpent skin is about that founding Catholic myth of Eve being evil, and me wanting to rewrite that, and the role of the serpent in that he was instrumental in her downfall. It's also about the whole idea of transformation. Snakes are a pretty amazing, they hold so much. They work on so many levels. They're so flexible. We see snakes, and in terms of healing, the poison of the snakes can be used in medicines. If we want to have an expanded consciousness, some of those South American drugs, you take them to actually have a mystical experience. It's connected with the snake. So the snake is connected with not only transformation, but expansion. But then there's a whole lot of other things that I'm really, in the Australian vernacular, the colloquial things are just so great. Like, he's being snaky, his arm snakes out. He's being sly. The way that, and I really love the way that, because it's a crime novel, there's a crime that needs to be solved. That's all about shifting and twisting and snaking away from each other. So there's a lot of snakes. Snakes appear in this book so many times, like always beneath the grass, always beneath the words. There's the presence of a snake. I didn't get to choose I did get to choose the cover, but the publisher, the Pantera Press, which is a beautiful boutique publisher that really wants to sponsor books that create conversations. They just put so much into creating this beautiful kind of snaky, serpenty feel to it. And the thing is that there are other things on the book, because the roses are very important, because the beauty of the mother who's disappeared, that she had a very personal relationship with each of her 4 children. She made their lives possible she's the light in the bleakness. And not that I didn't feel it as bleak, but there was an experience of bleakness. And her experience with JJ is they both speak the language of flowers. And so there's a lot of flowers in the book that are metaphorically doing a lot of work. And I think there's a rosary in there, and the gum trees, because it's a very deeply Australian story, and it's located in a landscape that is troubled by drought and dryness, and the weather is so present in the book, as we are all familiar with in the country that we live in.
Is that why you're wearing roses tonight as well? Is that part of the subtle nod to your own work?
I love the idea, but
take
no.
it.
Actually, I wear roses a lot because I love Frida Kahlo. My husband is Mexican and my children are bicultural. And so we are very steeped in both Australian and Mexican culture. For Australian, I mean, also Irish, because I come from the land many generations ago, but it's very, very alive in our history and our stories. And so is the Mexican. So I think it's that, actually. Yeah.
More questions from our live audience? Zoom's doing all the heavy lifting. Let's give us another one.
Yeah. So there's a question about how long did it take to write? Because you mentioned there was a bit of a 10-year break there.
It's called having children. However, I did also never stop writing. I have written, in the 10 years, I've written 3 other novels, but this one took a long time because it is so steeped in my world, and I felt like I had to write that before I could go on to write other things. And as I said, the writing of it, each word is so important that actually I drafted and drafted. I remember a friend of mine, who's quite a famous writer, she's got a book at the moment, Nikki Gemmell. She was telling me about how she writes. She said, oh, I had to write 14 drafts. I said, 14? Are you joking? Like, when I learn to write, I won't need that many. Turns out I needed quite a lot more. So yeah, I spent a lot of time with my characters and a lot of time in the craft of writing as well as the imagination of it. And then you give it to your publisher and they stamp draft 1, and then the process begins again. So you get a structural edit, and then you get a close edit, and you get proof edit, and then you go back into that imaginative world. But the reason why it worked for me so well is because I knew the voice and the tone and everything about every single character, so that when my publishers came to me and said, what about this? I immediately knew, no, that wouldn't work, or yeah, that's totally on the money. That's fantastic. So it's like there's a lot of, I think of writing as we think of writing as people on their own. I don't. The writing comes from a very deep place within one person, and then you share it and they create deep places with it, and then you share it with the readers and then they create a relationship with it. So I think the book isn't written until it's read, because each person in this room and in the wider world reads it differently. And I think that's we all create together.
We've got time for a couple more questions. Zoom.
Zoom is saying, so what are you moving on to after this process of writing for a long time? And this one, are you moving to another novel?
Oh, I've got to work much, much, much faster this time. But actually, because I know what I'm doing, I do already. I think it's partly because of the world that I was writing about being my own world, and I didn't want to kind of trouble. There are real people to be considered. Well, my next novel is I'm writing what I would like, I think of as a modern day witch story, in the same way that something like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is actually a modern day witch story. She's got, she's a hacker, for those of you who know the story, and that's her secret power, and she actually uses it. She's an outsider, and she's punished for being an outsider and a girl. I'm interested in that. So it's about this girl who kind of knows people's secrets, and then she finds the biggest secret of all, which is the dead baby under the ice. And then as it unfurls the crime, she goes up against a very powerful kind of international political guy who leads a cult. So it's quite a lot of, those kind of issues of power come into play yet again.
That's so intriguing. When is that one coming out?
Next June next year.
Cool. One more?
One more. There's a question about journalism and fiction, and the difference between them, particularly in the current climate for women. Do they both play different roles?
We all contribute. I am so grateful to these women journalists who are carrying the heavy load, because when I was in doing this in the 90s, really 80s and 90s, as a journalist, all of these issues were there, but you normalised them. You just went, okay, you have to avoid that minister, never interview him on his own, or make sure watch what you're wearing. You do all of that stuff. So to have these senior women holding this is a terrible image, but holding the blowtorch to the feet of this issue has made a significant difference, and it's only because there's so many of them. Telling real stories are incredibly powerful, but I think the job and the power of narrative storytelling just takes people in a much deeper way. I think they both work. For me, having been a journalist, what I bring to this work is I write fast, even though I've said I write a lot, I do write fast. I stick to deadlines. I know how to get the job done. I know how to be very disciplined. What I bring from writing is that imaginative, empathetic reach into what people might be feeling. And I don't suggest that journalism doesn't do that, but it's a constrained, artificial kind of storytelling. And you have much bigger canvas to do when you're actually writing with fiction. I would never really want to write an autobiographical story, not only because I find it less interesting than JJ's story, but actually you've got a bigger canvas because you're not constrained by the facts, but you need both to go forward.
I've got more. Yeah, give us. We've got time.
So there's a question from Bianca, which is, which authors are you inspired by? And two questions. Which authors were you inspired by? And also, was there an agent involved in your life getting your book to a publisher?
Yeah, I've always been quite strategic. So the first book I wrote was a non-fiction book. I'd been working as a foreign correspondent. I was pregnant and I had very, very difficult pregnancies. So every week I would go on Richard Glover, for those that don't know him, he does the Drive program and has for more than 25 years in New South Wales. A real doyen, but every week I would talk to him about my patch, what was happening, the coups and all that sort of stuff. But as I grew bigger and bigger, I would get greener and greener and, being nauseous and very sick. And so we'd end up talking about lime slices and things like that. So, because all I wanted to eat was lime slices and meat pies, which I'd never eaten before, but, So when I had the baby, my first child, Maya, he said, come back and talk about what that experience was. And because it was before women talked about the emotional journey of what that shift was, going from being a professional woman to actually not having much control and not being visible, and your relationships shift and change and your identities change, the switchboard lit up. So he said, we need you to come back every 7 weeks. And he called it Mini 7-Up for 2 years. So then I turned that into a book, and I decided to go and see, I went to see an agent because I thought that book will sell. So that will help me when I want someone to read my fiction. And it worked. So then I did get an agent, and she has been instrumental in being able to create the buzz around the book so that it actually finds a home. What was the other question? Oh, the things that I've been inspired by. I actually am inspired by people. I think the courage of everyday people just blows me away every moment. The stories that you hear from the journalists, from our own experience, my friends, I just think humans are incredible. Books that I love, I really love Toni Jordan's work because she does what I want to do, which is it's both rich plus it's very readable. You turn the pages. I really love books that, so I'm really into books that turn pages and actually build energy, and I'm really into books that are beautifully written and really connect you with the story. I can't think of one at the moment. So I will take that on notice. And if I come, I'll think about it, I'll get back to you.
And Toni Jordan's a good reference. I think we might be launching the next book in January or February next year.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be a big one, actually. Like there's a lot of energy behind that book. Yeah.
I think that's it from Zoom.
One more question from the live audience. No? Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Erina, for sharing with us.
And to you, thank you. And to all of you. It's been really good.
Thanks very much, Tegan. That was really fantastic. We're going to reconfigure back inside the shop. Unfortunately, we're back to masks, but we're going to do a signing, which is a joy really to get an in real life signing, because we haven't really done a lot of that in the last year and a half. So it's great to have you here, and we're going to put you in front of the shop. And the books, of course, are for sale. For those Zoom audience members still with us, the books are for sale online, but for everyone here, they're at the front counter, and we're going to come and do a signing. So join us inside. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Leaving.